South, the Pinewood High School Incident. Chapter 5. It was strange. The ringing in her ear caused Cassidy to writhe in pain for a day after what had happened. Even after the medicines she was given at the hospital, she was still suffering from headaches, something she was sure was nothing compared to what Amber must have been going through. She felt disgusting. Even as Penelope and Jessica visited her at her home and shared how the coven was in support of her. Even though Amber was annoying and seemed to be actively trying to harm her at times, she was still her best friend, and she had nearly killed her. As Cassidy sat in her room in silence one night, she found herself not being able to cry anymore, and a familiar thought found her. She waited for everyone to fall asleep before she made her way downstairs, her mind not focused on anything but what she felt she wanted. When she entered the kitchen, she found her way to the knife drawer and went for the handle. She paused before she could grab it, however, something in her psyche trying to prevent her from dealing with her pain. She managed to force herself past the warnings in her brain with great effort and tugged on the metal knob. When it opened, Cassidy gasped and began to feel a familiar anger. The drawer was empty. She searched every area of the kitchen for something to relieve herself, but all of the items she had previously used to prepare her meals were replaced with plastics. Even the glass items were removed. Styrofoam cups were now her family's new meta. When she realized that she wasn't going to get what she wanted, she went back to her room, fell onto her bed, and screamed into her pillow. It was a form of hell that she wanted to escape, but couldn't. A cruel punishment for her actions against her friend that seemed to be unbearable. The next day, Cassidy was sitting with her mother in the kitchen. The smell of weed was strong on the older woman, but Cassidy didn't care. Arthur hadn't come home from being out, and the two were worried about him. She wanted to call him again, but she knew that he wouldn't pick up. It was like him to get drunk and pass out, either at a friend's house or in his car, but that didn't make her or her mother feel any better. The two spending the majority of the morning in talks about calling the police. As they ate their breakfast with sunken expressions, Cassidy decided to break the silence. "How have you been doing with your sessions, Mom?" Cassidy didn't expect an answer. "I talked with one of the elders of the church last night." Her mother's response was barely audible. "They've been praying for us." "Oh, okay." Cassidy wasn't interested. The two women maintained their silence until, at nearly 11 o'clock, the sound of keys fumbling at the front door made both of them spring to life. Cassidy hurried to the door to welcome her brother home with a bombardment of questions. But when he walked in, Cassidy gasped as she witnessed her brother smile with a face filled with bruises and dried blood. Her breathing became shallow as she helped him get into the house while hearing her mother wailing as though he were dead. She set him at the kitchen table and fetched the first aid kit while her mother was posted at his side, shouting irrationally at him and demanding to know who had attacked him. It took a long while to get her under control, but they managed to get her to the backyard to collect herself. As the house returned to a calm state, Cassidy treated Arthur's wounds, Arthur making several glances at her as if he noticed something about her she didn't want him to know. As she finished stitching him up, Arthur grabbed her and held her tight in his arms. She wanted to protest like she did before, but she decided to let it slide, accepting that whatever had gone down that night, that he had gotten what he needed. The thought made her jealousy return. We're a matching pair now. She wanted to smile more. Cassidy continued her efforts to clean up her brother, and when the task was complete, she sat beside him and waited for him to speak. She couldn't remember the last time he had gotten into a fight, probably several years ago, and assumed that it was because of her. The sudden thought caused her to lower her head to look at the tiled floor of the kitchen. Her gaze remained there until, as if he noticed her downtrodden posture, Arthur confessed. I drank a little too much and a fight broke out. He trailed off. Yeah. Cassidy couldn't empathize. Was it because... Was it because of... Don't flatter yourself, kid. Arthur forced a chuckle. It was just some punks that got pissed. We should talk about what happened with you, though. Cassidy didn't like being in a hot seat, but she knew that there was no avoiding it anymore. Over the last few nights, she had been having terrible thoughts, her medicines seeming to not help in purging her anguish. She got up and went to get them some water before sitting back down to discuss the heavy topic. She detailed the events before, how the girls had maintained an odd relationship for the last few months, and how they had been growing distant as a result. When she thought back to how beaten Amber had looked when she came to, Cassidy began to cry. I see. Arthur took a sip of his water before continuing. Cass, I have to be honest with you. That's not a good look. I know that you've seen the replacement utensils and glass. I know I'm not dad, but... Arthur, Cassidy stopped him. I joined a group at school. They've been helping me with taking back control of my life, you know? Oh yeah, the witches. Arthur's displeasure floated over to Cassidy. We've met. I'm not going to lie to you, Cass. I don't trust them. It seems too convenient that they targeted you, of all people. In the state that you're in. A frown found its way to Cassidy as she sat back in her chair and folded her arms. Thinking to how her sisters were nothing but supportive of her during her time of need made her confused as to why Arthur couldn't see how awesome they were. She thought on how Jessica had been bringing her schoolwork and company over the last few days, the acts themselves serving to relieve her anxiety, if only slightly. She prepared to defend her new family when, as if they had been listening to the conversation, the doorbell rang throughout the house. Arthur got up to answer and, sure enough, it was Jessica, accompanied by Penelope, Tara, and Gabriella. The girls seemingly forced their way in past the home's sentry and directly to Cassidy. Hey girl, Jessica brightened up the moody atmosphere. I'm back, with some unwanted company. As the girls began to fill the space with laughter and antics, Cassidy managed to break the immersion to see Arthur off in the background, his serious-looking face blending into the shadows of the home. She could tell that he was not pleased with them, but she was happy. She wondered why she was always disappointing the people that were in her life, but as Penelope pulled her attention to her for a show of some crafts she was working on, she turned back to see that her brother was gone, replaced with the dark interior of the house. The girls continued to enjoy their day together, sharing craft tips, gossiping about people within the school, and cleaning up Cassidy's style, the depressed conservative girl being transformed into the image of a true witch. It wasn't by much, but Cassidy could feel herself becoming something, rather someone, she didn't recognize, and it felt good. It was so intoxicating, in fact, that she had forgotten about the reason she was in that mess in the first place. Time sped forward as the evening approached, each of the girls growing hungry and ready to indulge in something other than conversation. At Tara's command, the coven prepared to leave the house, their next stop being the effigy burning that Cassidy had completely forgotten about. Don't sweat it, girl, Penelope grinned as she began to follow the other girl's lead and head towards the front door. All you need to do is bring something that you hold close to your heart. The rest will reveal itself to you when you get there. As the girls all left out of the front door, Cassidy was the last to follow behind them, searching frantically to find something within the place to take with her to the event. She found herself standing in her room and pondering what it was that she held in her heart the most, and suddenly remembered. On her vanity, underneath a few binders and other items, was her father, the two of them locked in an eternal embrace. She took the picture and shoved it into her back pocket before rushing downstairs to catch a ride with the anxious girls. As she made herself downstairs to leave the house, she was met by none other than her mother, the older woman standing as a physical barrier between Cassidy and her freedom. It was as if they were at a crossroad, the two standing off against each other, with their words being their only means of combating each other. Cassidy had no intention of dealing with her mother, her mind solely focused on being a part of the coven's gathering. But her mother had other plans for her, apparently. The standoff continued for longer than Cassidy had wanted, until she decided to make a move towards the door. Instinctively, her mother moved to block her escape. I think that you should stay home, Cassidy, Sandra said with a clarity that Cassidy hadn't heard in a while. I'm going out, Mom. Cassidy felt a chill. Her resolve was set. The two women stared at each other for a moment longer before their contest was disrupted by the honking of Jessica's car horn. Cassidy moved to leave the home, but Sandra blocked her path again, this time becoming physical with her arrogant daughter. Cassidy felt a familiar heat in her build as she struggled against her mother, the two taking things a bit too far. Without thinking, Cassidy shoved Sandra out of the way with enough force to make her stumble into the nearby coat rack. As quickly as the girl had gotten the door open, however, her mother regained her footing and grabbed her before she could leave the home. Let me go, Cassidy struggled. No, Sandra's voice trembled. Without thinking, Cassidy flailed in Sandra's embrace and swung her arms wildly, her elbow managing to connect to her mother's nose. A yell escaped Sandra as she fell back onto the wooden floor of the vestibule and immediately began to treat her bloodied nose. Cassidy's heart raced as she witnessed what she had done to yet another person she had cared about and wanted to care for her. But as she did, Sandra pushed her away. You want to leave so bad? Then go. Her mother's rage stabbed her through. Mom, I didn't mean to. Get out of my house, Sandra gasped. Cassidy backed away from her mother just as Arthur had entered the space from upstairs. His confusion was enough for Cassidy to maneuver around, taking the opportunity to leave the house before any questions could be asked. As she stepped out into the late autumn evening, Cassidy took a deep breath and calmed her breathing while walking towards her sister's car. her victory coming at the expense of her mother's suffering. It was odd to her how all of the recent events that transpired made her feel as though she were not human, rather, some other form of creature set to react rather than to rationalize. When she got in the car, instead of breaking down and crying like she expected, she simply smiled and accepted her new normal. The trip away from her house had begun with an awkward silence as Cassidy stayed to herself and in her own thoughts. Jessica had cautioned the others to leave her alone, picking up on the trouble her sister had gotten herself into. They didn't ride in silence, however, the girls being treated to yet another volley of Jessica's rock hits. Tara, Penelope, and Gabriella occupied the front passenger, rear driver, and middle seats, respectively, which forced Cassidy to take the seat behind Tara. As they made themselves away from Pinewood, Tara decided to ask Cassidy a decisive question as they reached the northern tip of Charleston Heights, the Bay Area growing darker as they entered a swath of forest. So, was it your intention to take James from Jess like that, or did you ask her first? Shut up, Tara. Jessica tried to defend her again. You're so annoying. I have to admit that I am curious as well, Cassidy. Penelope chimed in. Is our little cat a lioness in waiting? The girls grew quiet as they waited for her to respond. Cassidy, at first, felt a little embarrassed at their insinuations, but she was tired of being the sensitive one. Of all the things she had been witness to over the last few months, after cowering behind her emotional instability and lack of positive reinforcement, she felt as though it was time for her to be a part of the noise. She gave in and stooped to their level. I didn't think that I had it in me to be a homewrecker, but whoever does, Cassidy said with a seriousness that made the car grow silent for a bit. The empty quiet continued until Cassidy let out a slight chuckle that cascaded into a maddening laughter, catching the other girls off guard and causing them all to join in. Jessica was the last to smile from the comment, and Cassidy took notice, making sure not to piss her off the rest of the ride. The remainder of the drive went over well enough until they reached an area that she was unfamiliar with, a dark expanse of woods and no streetlights. The only other source of light that she could notice were the reflections of street signs and the moon, which was thankfully full. After a few more turns, the girls arrived at a gate that led further into the dark, which they all seemed familiar with. Okay, rock, paper, scissors for who's getting out, Jessica commanded. You too, new girl. The unexpected tournament went on for a few minutes, with each contestant doing their best to not be the one made to enter the dark. First, it was Jessica, who won against Tara, and then Tara, who won against Penelope. Penelope lost against Gabriella and was then made to battle Cassidy, who managed to lose in a best 2 out of 3 matchup. Not wanting to be a sore loser, Cassidy made her way out of the car and into the night air, instantly regretting her acceptance of the defeat. She was at least thankful that the light from the headlights of Jessica's car illuminated the area well. But as she began to fumble with the lock on the heavy metal gate, the headlights mysteriously went out, leaving her completely in the dark. Jess, come on, she called out, but received no answer. Before panic could set in, Jessica's headlights came back on and nearly blinded her. After hearing the girls in the car laughing and snickering at her misfortune, Cassidy unlocked the gate and pushed it open, rushing back to the car before her companions could come up with another nefarious plot. When she was safely back in the car, the girls welcomed her back with laughter and jokes that made her feel like she was really a part of the group. A longer stint of driving was made through the dark woods until they came to a campsite in a clearing that accepted the moonlight well. After parking and getting out of the car, the girls huddled together and prepared the area by setting up tiki torches for more light and a grill for what Cassidy had assumed to be food. Not too much longer after setting up their area for use, another vehicle approached and parked beside Jessica's. Stepping out from the car were a few guys she didn't know, Heather and James, Cassidy feeling herself shiver with an unfamiliar excitement. Hey girls, look who I brought. Heather's boastful attitude made Cassidy think of Amber. Also, there may or may not be booze. You'll have to wait till later to find out. The guys instantly began to offload the items they brought, a large cooler that they made seem heavy by how much they grunted while moving it, some more sources of light that they set up near the grill, and other assorted items that she assumed were there to help them pass the time. It didn't take them long to get the food going, one of them helping the witches build their effigy, while another began conversing with some of the girls. It was a scene that Cassidy expected of one of her teen drama shows to present her with, the ideal version of high school that she was averse to for so long. As she continued to watch the entertainment, however, she was suddenly approached by James, his stealthy approach making her jolt to attention. Whoa, hey, Cass. His smile made her heart flutter. I'm glad that you came out tonight. Yeah, me too, she said while beginning to twist. They stood together for nearly a minute before Cassidy decided to look into his eyes. It was hard to tell with the little available light, but she could see how inviting his gaze was despite the meager flames. With no warning, James opened his arms to her in an attempt to hug her, which made the blood in Cassidy's body rush to her cheeks to meet her suitor. Without hesitation, she walked into his reach and enjoyed the warmth of their union under the harvest moon. Hey. His voice was as masculine as his choice of cologne. Hey, Cassidy said while still clinging to her man. You two want a room? Tara called from further towards the fire pit. The pit's not going to set itself. Cassidy was unaware that their embrace had lasted longer than a regular hug should have, but she regretted nothing as they separated. As they made themselves over to the fire pit, she brushed her hair over her ear as James made small talk to clear the awkwardness Tara brought to the moment. Her mind rested on how gentle a soul he had seemed, and continued to walk closer to him in hopes that his confidence would somehow rub off on her. They reached the pit, and as James went to make the finishing touches on the effigy, he must have noticed Cassidy was holding her arms in a vain attempt to keep the cold out, deciding to take off his leather jacket to wrap it around the frigid girl. Hold on to it for me, okay? His strong smile made her melt. Okay. Her heart bumped again. I will, thank you. Cassidy took a seat and watched as her new group of friends joked and shuffled about their tasks, setting up everything in a relatively quick amount of time. There were 5 torches set around their circular perimeter, and a large pyre of wood was stacked at the center, shaped in the image of a human, and seemed as though it would burn for the remainder of the night. When time came, Jessica called the girls to attention and told the boys to stand outside of the circle. Cassidy's confusion continued to mount, as everyone seemed to move as if they were familiar with the practice, only managing to ask a question when everything was set. "Hey, Jess," Cassidy tried to mouth as she looked around at the girls positioned around her. "What are we doing?" "Think of it as us preparing for change," Jessica said as she motioned for Cassidy to stand near one of the torches. "You've already been a part of that change, so now all you have to do is give up your past and welcome your future." When she was in position, Jessica began to lead the girls in a type of mantra, an odd twist of commands that were seemingly aimed at the night sky above them. While she spoke, Heather walked clockwise around the gathered girls with a chalice, each of them taking a swig of its contents without question. When it was her turn, Cassidy hesitated slightly, but went through with it anyway, her throat being set on fire as the contents from the cup made its way through her body. She coughed a bit after, but other than the instant warmth she felt after, she was relatively fine. Once all of the girls were bound by their drinking, the ritual continued. After leading the girls through the initial opening of the ritual, Jessica began to share her past as she approached the effigy. At the conclusion of her statements, she set the effigy alight, the glow of a small flame quickly growing into a roaring blaze. She tossed something into the fire at the conclusion of her affirmation, something that the other girls did as well, and when it was her turn, they all looked to her to say something. She followed how to go about the ritual by witnessing the others, but she was still unsure as to if her thoughts would collect themselves enough to be coherent with her speech. She abandoned the notion of being perfect and spoke plainly. "I let go," she said with words made her own. "I let go of my pain, the despair of a past behind me. My Father, I give you up to the universe, star above, earth beneath, given to oneness by the fire within me. By blood, by nature, by spirit," the witches said in unison. Cassidy approached the burning effigy and held the picture of her father against it to gaze at the man she loved above all others, before casting him into the fire. As she watched her memory turn to ash, she felt a few tears fall. She felt good, however, as if she was tapping into something that was forbidden and raw, a surge of direct power from a power plant lighting a light bulb to an impossible degree. It was the intoxication with her newfound source that made her feel warm and drunk. The sound of drums from one of the guys outside the circle flooding her lust for acceptance as she began to dance. When the tempo of their communion concluded, she fell onto a nearby log and hugged herself with James's jacket while taking in the sight of flames. "That was intense," James said as he approached and sat beside her. Cassidy must have taken him by surprise as, before he could get comfortable, she leaned into him, allowing him to hold her again. They maintained silence as the background noises of the others seemed to fade into obscurity, James managing to use his free hand to hold hers. They remained like that for an uncertain amount of time, until a thought entered her mind. She was sure that she was going to ruin the mood, but she wasn't going to hold back if they were going to be together. "What happened between you and Jess?" Her bluntness surprised even her. He readjusted. "We had fun, but we weren't as compatible as we thought. Her life is on another level that I just didn't fit into, you know?" "Do you think we'd be compatible?" she maneuvered. James didn't answer at first. his gaze set on the fading fire ahead of them. After pondering the question a bit too long for Cassidy's liking, he released her and stood. She began to wonder if her questioning was a bit too forward when, as if to assure her that it wasn't, he held out his hand to help her to her feet. She accepted and rose to meet his intent. His passionate eyes held her in place as they stood in front of the pyre. She wanted to do it then, her trembling body ready to accept whatever he was willing to do to her. James leaned in as if prepared to do just that, but managed to dart past her lips and whispered in her ear instead, "Follow me." They didn't walk that far. The sounds of the others having their fun by the fire made Cassidy feel safe as she walked with her man through the dark woods. Even with the moon lighting their way through the footpath, she felt the need to stay as close to James as possible in case they somehow separated. Not too much further into their journey together did they reach another opening near a shoreline. The glistening water of the bay area opening to the ocean made Cassidy gasp. She felt as though she were being rewarded for trusting her guide, her excitement causing her to wander closer to the edge of the sandy shore. As she continued to look up at the moon, James walked up behind her, turned her to face him, and pulled her in for a kiss. "James, wait." Cassidy pulled away from him reluctantly. "You have to know, I'm not right in the head. I've done stuff to myself and—" "No, Cassidy." James stared back at her with confidence. "That was before. It's different now. You're with me now." Under the light of the early October moon, in a place removed from the worries and stress of her life, Cassidy was finally accepted for who she was by someone she felt would be there for her whenever she needed. She gave in to her desire, James making sure to take care of her delicate existence with great care. To her disappointment, they didn't do much other than kiss, but as they finished with their bonding, something caught Cassidy's attention. Something akin to the feeling that something was watching them. Even as she made her way back to the group to end the night, she felt its eyes on her, a gaze like that of a predator trained on its prey. The ride home was a strange affair. The presence she felt kept up with the sedan as they drove away from the campsite, through the cities, and down the dark streets of Pinewood. Jessica had dropped off the other girls at their homes before the car was silent with just the two of them. Cassidy felt as though she should say something to her, but she didn't know what words to begin with. As she pondered what to say, however, Jessica beat her to the punch with a confessional. Cassidy had thought she'd be more surprised at Jessica's resolve, but reminded herself that it was her friend that was the bold one up until that night. "Did you and James have fun?" she asked with a lightheartedness that Cassidy wasn't ready for. "Are you upset with me?" Cassidy wanted to cower. "Girl, no." Jessica reinvigorated the moment. "It was me that set you two up." "Cassidy, there might be some stuff we might not agree on, but you're a person just like me. Make your choices and stick by them, okay?" Cassidy began to grab herself as if she was cold. Jessica took notice and turned the heat on, but it didn't seem to have much of an effect as Cassidy continued to shiver. As they reached the street and pulled into the driveway, Jessica stopped her before she could leave the car, her eyes fixed on her like a concerned mother. She took a minute to look around her car before closing her eyes and focusing on something Cassidy didn't notice. "You feel it too, don't you?" she asked quickly. "Ever since me and James were in the woods," Cassidy answered with a tightening gut. What is it, Jess? I'm scared. I think it's... Hold on, Jessica said as she opened her glove box to retrieve a bundle of sage. Make sure that you ward your home for the next few days. We exposed ourselves to the spirits, and one could try to interact with you. It felt as though she was suddenly thrown into a pit of uncertainty. The air around her became difficult to breathe. She wondered if she should ask to stay with Jessica instead of going home. But she didn't want to have whatever was after her try to harm her sister as well. Cassidy gripped James's jacket again, this time to squeeze any support she could from it to little effect. She looked back to Jessica and confirmed her worry with the more experienced witch. What do you mean? Cassidy's anxiety began to grasp at her throat. I mean that it's a part of the process, Jessica said as she placed the sage in her hands. You're an empath, remember? You have to make sure to take precautions, okay? With a long hug and an agreement to have Jessica call when she got in, Cassidy stepped out of her sister's car and walked up to her comparatively humble home. When she was inside, she noticed that the house was dark and quiet, exactly what she didn't want, so she turned on every light that she could find. When the house was nice and lit, she began her purging with the sage like Jessica had suggested. She walked all around the interior of the house with the burning bundle of incense until she was satisfied with herself and felt accomplished. It took a while for her to gather the courage to go upstairs and attempt sleep, and after turning the lights off in the house, she made her way upstairs and fell onto her bed. Sleep came surprisingly easy for her as Cassidy lay alone in the dark, her mind fading to the events of the ritual as if it were some horror movie she was watching. She felt cold still, even under her covers, and wondered why the pervading chill had followed her home, but her exhaustion was greater. As she lay in her bed, asleep without dreaming, however, something began to feel wrong, a feeling like she was still being watched. Nausea overcame her, which forced her out of her rest, sitting up in her bed a bit before deciding to go downstairs for some reason. As she walked through the dark house, she felt a sense of unease press on her, as if the dark itself was trying to wrap around her. When she made it to the stairs, she was about to take a step down them, but something like a cold touch pressed against her back and made her turn sharply in its direction. Of course, there was nothing behind her, but she could hear a sort of growling noise coming from her mother's room, something that sounded like eating. She took a deep breath to calm herself before walking over to the door and turned the handle. The door opened well enough and was uninhibited as it creaked, revealing nothing inside but her mother resting silently on her bed. Cassidy managed to find her breath and was about to close the door and leave, but she found herself looking around the room for one last time. To her horror, sitting in the darkest part of her mother's room was a dark figure, staring at her with red eyes and breathing heavily like a panting animal. The loud noises that the creature was making continued to grow with each second, Cassidy feeling as though she wasn't supposed to be acknowledging it. This staring contest continued for longer than she had wanted, and just as soon as she had noticed the monstrosity, it sharply stood and seemingly flew towards her. Panic overtook her as Cassidy did her best to escape the clutches of the demon. She wanted to yell and warn her mother, but she was more focused on escaping and the thought slipped her mind. She made it to the stairs and tried to escape her pursuer, but she wasn't fast enough. Before she could take a true step down the staircase, a pair of searing claw-like hands pushed her forward. She screamed, not because of the fact that she was falling down the stairs into what seemed like hell itself, but from the pain from her fresh brand. With a thud, she heard her neck snap, which forced her to lay motionless at the base of the stairs. With a quick look in the direction she fell, Cassidy stopped breathing as the demon made its way down the stairs in an unnatural approach. The mass of darkness reached her lifeless corpse and pressed its foot or hoof into her chest. Although she couldn't move anymore, she could still feel the pain of her skin being further branded. She wanted to mouth something, but she was dead, so nothing came out as the demon revealed its husk of a face to her, a particular horror that she couldn't explain with words. It roared, or there was something like a roar, as she felt it bore itself into her body. The pain was intense and unfathomable, but part of her began to strangely accept it. The pain began to subside, and she began to feel something else, something akin to a particular form of lust. Her body felt hot as she began to writhe and squirm to her new inhabitant, positioning itself inside of her, making her feel pain and pleasure with every moment of her possession. She hated herself for being pathetic, and the feelings she had felt before began to swell up. She wanted to do it again, to cut it out of herself so that she would be free, but she also loved being forced to accept what was in her. As she began to move on her own, she tried to look around and saw that she was back in her room. The light of the morning dawn seeped its way past her curtains as it had done countless times before.